Tim Linder here. I want to talk to you about two different kind of graphics, one of them being vector and one of them being raster graphics. A raster graphic is made of pixels, and inside of Photoshop, it primarily uses raster-based graphics. So if I get my zoom tool and I were to zoom far enough into an image, I'm able to see the individual pixels or the smallest element in this image. Okay, a raster image. I think by default I have it turned off on my machine, but there's also a pixel grid that is oftentimes on that designates what a pixel is and what isn't, but I usually turn that off. I don't need to see those little white lines. At some point when you zoom out in Photoshop, those will kind of go away and you won't see them anymore, but I turn them off by default here under pixel grid, so I never have to see them. But if you zoom in, you're able to see a raster-based image is made of pixels. Now I'm going to quickly jump over to a different Adobe application called Illustrator to show an example of a vector-based image, one that isn't necessarily made of these little dots or pixels. So I'm going to jump over to Illustrator. Was in Photoshop, now I'm in Illustrator. You can see Illustrator up here, and the tools look quite similar, but they are different. There's some that have commonality. But anyway, as I look at this image, it says, oh, that looks pretty photorealistic. But if I were to zoom in on this, I could zoom and zoom and zoom and zoom and zoom and zoom, and it never really breaks down to those rectangular pixels, because this image is made of points and lines and curves and mathematical formulas rather than pixels. If I zoom way out, it still looks fairly photorealistic, but as I zoom far enough in, it never breaks down to a pixel, but I can tell that, oh, this isn't necessarily some sort of photorealistic image. I can also look up here and view the outlines and see, oh, these are the outlines that are created. There's gradients within those shapes and things like that inside of Illustrator. I'm going to go back to preview. But as I look inside these images, if I want to change something, it isn't really painting a pixel a different color or a square a different color. I'm going to unlock these layers here. I can grab some different elements of this image here. Not sure why those aren't grabbing. Let's zoom back out. Let's see. I can grab my direct selection tool and select some of these points and lines and curves and adjust and move them around, or I could change them individually if I wanted to. Just this point of that headlight I can move around. So this is an image that is a vector-based image that's made of points and lines and curves and not necessarily pixels. Illustrator being something that deals with vector-based images, Photoshop dealing with raster-based images. But that doesn't mean they can kind of handle both. Just like if you're in Excel, Microsoft Excel, you can do some sort of, text formatting and things like that. And if you're in Microsoft Word, it can handle some tables and import maybe some sort of spreadsheet material and things like that. So Photoshop and Illustrator primarily work with vector or raster-based images, but they can do both. They do have tools that can handle a little bit of both. But I'm going to jump back to Photoshop here real quick. So this image being a raster-based image inside of Photoshop, based on pixels and things like that, there are tools inside of Photoshop that can introduce vector-based objects in them. They're just represented in a layer as pixels. Okay, so let me show you what happens here. So let's say these tools down here, the ellipse tool and my direct selection tool and my pen tool, okay? These are tools that deal with vector-based graphics inside of Photoshop, primarily a raster-based application. So if I were to get an ellipse tool here, and let's just grab a color here, I'm gonna grab a blue color ellipse, and as I drag this, now before I drag it, we're going to get into a deeper conversation later about this specific tool, but I want to make sure I go up here and I'm choosing shape or path. So I'm going to be creating a shape tool, and I'm going to fill it with that foreground color, and it's going to have a stroke of black, and these are my options. But anyway, as I create this object, I'll see that it creates this layer, this over in my layers panel, that is a vector-based layer. It's got this little icon that shows that it's a vector-based layer, right? So if I were to get my direct selection tool and I were to grab on a point, I can change this object. It's going to turn into a live path. I'll go ahead and do that. So it's going to change this object and manipulate it. Rather than painting pixels, I'm moving handlebars and points and lines and curves. So when we start to think about printing something on a large sheet of paper, a vector-based object is not limited by the amount of pixels. If you print it larger and larger and larger, the computer can just adjust the mathematical formula and get your line nice and smooth no matter how large you print it. So that's a big benefit with vector-based images. Another vector-based benefit is that the file size in general, how much space it takes up on your hard drive, is probably a little less oftentimes because it's not having to keep all the information of what is inside every single pixel in this huge resolution image. It's just kind of keeping mathematical formulas and what those shapes, colors are filled with, gradients or colors. And so the file sizes are often a little bit smaller. So size independent, don't have to worry if you're printing something really, really large, a big poster with a vector-based file, for it to break down at some point when you print it too large. If you don't have enough pixels or resolution, that doesn't matter in a vector-based image. However, in a raster-based image, the benefit would be you can get something that's a lot more photorealistic. Things like your camera sensor or your phone sensor when it takes a picture, or a scanner as it scans some information, is going to be able to operate and work on the basis that it's ingesting or creating a raster-based image, and can kind of create this kind of photorealistic look a little bit easier, represent it a little bit easier than creating these points and lines and curves. Not to say that I can't take this image, select all, copy. I'm going to jump back over to Illustrator. I'm going to create a new document inside of Illustrator, and I'm going to paste my image here. I don't know why I lost that blue. Let me go back to Photoshop. Oh, I copied my vector later. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go back to Illustrator. I'm going to create new, and I'm going to hit paste. And there is my raster-based image inside of Illustrator. But I could take it, and with specific tools inside of Illustrator, I can turn that into a vector-based shape. So I'll go up to Window, and then I'm going to go to Image Trace, and I'm going to say, all right, let's turn this into a color image that I have to choose the amount of colors that I want. Let's say that I'll go all the way up to 30, and I'm going to preview this. It might take it a little bit because it's kind of a large image. But as I preview this, it represents it as a shape, mathematical formulas. But as I zoom in, I can tell, boy, it doesn't really represent it all that great in, photorealistic terms. Now this would be great if I wanted to scale it up. I'll never have to worry about the pixels and things like that, but it doesn't necessarily represent it as well as a raster-based image. So those are the two differences between raster-based images and vector-based images, and how you can use the different files in each. And if I were to take this different types of files in each, and if I were to open a vector-based image inside of Photoshop, that cutlass image that I was showing you earlier, and I want to bring that into Photoshop, file open that vector-based image inside of Photoshop, going from vector to raster, I'm going to turn all those points and lines and shapes into a raster pixel-based image. I'm given the option here. How many pixels do I want to give it? I could give it as many as I want to. I can make this as large or as small as I want to because I'm unlimited. It's just going to change that mathematical formula however I want. If I choose OK, and it brings it into Photoshop, at some level, I'm going to zoom in now inside of Photoshop. And while, it looks good from far out, as I zoom in, I'll get that those pixels will show. Unlike inside of Illustrator, when I was looking at those shapes, as I zoom in and in and in, I'm never seeing those pixels. It's always just giving me that nice straight line.